Well, welcome
Right.
everybody, and thanks once again, Shrikant, Joe, and the whole gang for having me here. And as was mentioned, I'm writing a book about Bucky's ideas, specifically comprehensive anticipatory design science. And we have a few sessions already recorded. We started those sessions with comprehensivity, and then we went to anticipation, and then design science. And then we kind of looped back because we realized there were pieces that were important in understanding uh, how to use these different approaches and tools. And so this is one more of those. It's kind of a bridge uh, between the ideas of seeing systems comprehensively and then coming up with our preferred future, anticipation. So that's what today is about. And at the beginning, I have a fair amount of stuff taken directly out of Synergetics. And this is taken from the R.W. Gray uh, uh, website, where he took both volumes and integrated them. And if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend you check it out. Um, I'll put it in the chat eventually, or if somebody else online wants to put it in the chat to tell people where to find it, that's even better. So we're starting with a number of the initial sections from section 400, which was about systems. And we're going to look at some of the basics that Bucky explained to us and talk about interacting systems, because it's kind of the context for every situation we find is to understand, our system of interest, which he, showed as a circle, the larger systems around it, the smaller systems inside it, but then in particular, how systems interact. Because what we see in every situation is a multiplicity of interacting systems. And those determine what we see today in the present. And so then if we're looking to solve a challenge, that challenge arises from this system interaction. And of course, if we want to have a more desirable future, well, guess what? That also depends on how our new vision or new systems fit into this uh, larger systems that will exist in the future. So then what you'll see here is, to make it a little bit more readable from my perspective, is I've added a little italicized text. This is not in Bucky's text, but it helps me kind of put my arms around his ideas. So then, right towards the beginning of section 400, he talks about a system as the first subdivision of universe. And he goes on to say it divides the universe into multiple parts. And I identify the first one as a division in space. That's the events occurring geometrically outside, and then the events occurring geometrically inside. Next, he talks about what I consider time, the universal events occurring non-simultaneously, remotely, and unrelatedly prior to the system events. And then he mentions those subsequent to system events. So this to me is thinking in space, or in time, I should say. So we're thinking in time and space. Another view of this material and his explanation of how a system divides universe into everything outside, everything inside, is kind of a structural view, right? And he's saying, well, really the system is a geometrical arrayed system of events. That's the system of itself. And remember now, this doesn't necessarily have to be a physical system. It could be a metaphysical system. It could be thought. And then finally, what I'll say is a relational view. And what he's saying is that, in addition to what I just have defined for you, right, which is the stuff outside and inside, the stuff before and after, the stuff invents, in the here and now. There's all these other things, what I sometimes call system adjacency. And I put this down as relations. So that's how we begin, is basic Bucky. If we proceed along to the next part of it, he further describes it, and this is just, I won't say an elaboration necessarily, maybe clarification, but he clarifies something you'll see in the diagram we're going to talk about later, that we have systems that are larger and slower. Once again, this is the outside. Then we have systems that are smaller and faster, and these are the things inside. And then we have the system itself. He also mentions just next to that we only see what we tune in to see. There are other configurations of systems that are there, but we have tuned into a particular set of events, if you will, and that really every system is subject to generalized principles. This should be familiar to us now with studying Bucky. These are diagrams from Synergetics, once again, taken from the set of web pages that RDO Grape put together. This one's a little hard to see. It's even a little hard in the original. But what you can see is that the double line in the center is the system of interest. And then, of course, inside is the things that are too small and too fast, and outside are things that are too large and too slow. And he talks about these as just sometimes sort of at the edge of our perception, that we can kind of tell they exist, but they may not be entirely clear. This is explained quite well in a fuller explanation by Amy Edmondson. And she clarifies that, this idea of, tuning into a particular system or set of events is like walking into a room. And what do we see? Do we see the room? Do we see the chair? Do we see the cushion on the chair? And as we do that, we focus in on that as the system. And yet we're still aware of things that are larger and slower and smaller and faster. And so Bucky wants us to make clear that we always have this, right? We never see anything in isolation. We know the outsideness and the connectedness in that sense. We also know the insideness and the pieces that make things up. And then at the end of it, she says, almost half jokingly, what kind of things constitute a system? Well, from a chair to a tetrahedron to a thought, which we mentioned before, that systems can be metaphysical. In requirements for a dwelling advantage, he has another version of this diagram. And this one, I think, is easier to read, perhaps a little clearer. And once again, you'll see the double lines in the middle, and that's the shelter or the dwelling itself. And so then he has a fair amount of detail outside about how the dwelling that we design, the system we design as a dwelling, protects, if you will, the people within it from all these things that are larger, maybe infrequent, maybe bigger in terms of stuff like storms, etc. And then, of course, the things that are inside it, like the humans and the subsystems of the humans. So this, to me, is just a little clearer explanation of what we're talking about when we're tuning in. So once again, we're saying when we begin any exercise, the process of comprehensive anticipatory design science, we're starting with this sort of tuning into the system of interest without neglecting the larger and slower systems and the smaller and faster systems. Now, I've created a version of this that was inspired by a thing called trees, or a theory of inventor problem solving. And this just gives you a different way to view it. This should not be surprising at all. This is just kind of a different way of viewing Bucky's diagram. And so then the super system surrounds the thing that we're looking at. This was developed for biomimicry, and it's used, by a number of groups to explore the fact that when we look at one thing of interest, which could be a design challenge, or it could be an organism, right? We're interested in how a cactus or a fruit fly relates to things. We should see it in the context of both the larger systems, the smaller systems, which you see as subsystems, as well as the adjacent systems, which in biomimicry are a pretty important thing, system adjacency. And that's the upper left one. The lower right one is where I tried to map this into a business sense for people interested in using these ideas as a business application. And in the book, at this point, I have an appendix about designing a shed. It seems like an understandable situation where most of us can imagine doing such a thing. And we can also see the utility of looking at the larger systems, right? Like the yard, the community, the neighbors. Well, the neighbors are an adjacent system, the weather, as well as being aware of the subsystems, which are, well, what are you going to put within that shed and how are you going to use it? And so you would say, well, Mr. McNamara, I just intuitively do this, and that's fine. You should, and you are all excellent systems thinkers. However, having a diagram that you can then share with somebody else makes your thinking explicit, and then helps the other users and other people impacted by it see what's going on. So it's just a very useful way to explore something. And then this is that original diagram from trees called 9 windows or system operator. And this one is a little different. You'll see the system of interest in the center box. This is, Bucky's lucidly relevant, right? In this case, though, they don't put the subsystems within it. They put the subsystems below it, if you will. So then right below that center are the subsystems. And once again, they don't put the supersystems around it, but they put them above it. And so if you look at this, you'll understand why I created the different version of the Explorer for biomimicry. I just thought it was graphically easier to understand this embeddedness, if you will. The reason I put this in is to demonstrate that one of the more powerful things about the trees view is that they're suggesting you simultaneously view this in time. So on the left, you see time in the past, and you can say, oh, what did the super system look like in the past? Because it may be that you could have some resource from the super system in the past that would actually help the challenge in the present. The same way with the subsystems in the past. And excuse me, maybe more importantly for our discussion tonight, in the future, if you have, so the right column in the middle is our new design, our preferred future, all this wonderful stuff. It really, to make that happen, it depends upon a super system that either supports it or we've adapted to a different, a super system that exists in the future. And that's a really important thing. We can have brilliant designs, but if they aren't sort of tuned into the systems that exist today and in the future, it'll be very difficult to get people to accept them. And once again, the subsystems in the future may enable this to happen. And you can think of this kind of as something related to emergence, right? So we're kind of familiar with the term emergence, birds flocking, bees deciding on a new home, or building a hive, or ants foraging, slime molds, etc. All these social insects, I think mostly call them, produce higher levels of complexity by these simple interactions. And that's really one way we could design, right? For the future, we could design interactions among subsystems in that lower right corner that would then develop into systems in the future that depend on those individual behaviors. So then, this is me pausing for a moment and saying, okay, I want you to just sit for, 30 seconds or a minute and think about something that you want to see happen in the future. And then we'll open up the chat, and in fact, or you can just speak by putting exclamation point in the chat if you want to talk about it. Tell us, what the super system is that surrounds your system today, and in the future you'd need to adapt to, essentially. So what are some examples? We know that Bucky suggested there are a number of ways to make system change, and the biggest one, if you will, is we don't fight the existing system, we create a new system. And so an example for that would be microcredit. And if you haven't heard of microcredit, bear with me because I probably have this a little bit mangled, but it's not terribly bad. So in microcredit, you have people typically in a developing country, and they need access to a small amount of capital to do something. It might be a woman who could develop a weaving business a little bit further, but she needs, the equivalent of 50 or 100 US dollars to get enough supplies to create enough material to get to market. And so then a traditional bank would not be able to deal with this, right? It's just not the kind of transaction they would like. So then the Grameen Bank developed a system where basically people in the neighborhood or people throughout the country could say, well, you know what, I'll contribute the equivalent of $1 towards this thing. And then the woman who's starting this micro business, getting this micro loan, is essentially making a commitment to other people to pay it back. And so this enables an enormous amount of small industry to happen that wouldn't otherwise. So microcredit, the super system, is essentially, other people, neighbors, community members, other people that are members of the bank that say, okay, I will put up a few dollars to help you guys, get this new venture started. So the super system then would be that set of people. So sit and think about something you'd like to have happen. And like I said, we'll give you an almost awkward amount of time, which will only be 30 seconds or a minute. And then tell us about the super system that's going to, surround, encompass, that you're going to be a part of. And then just come back and either talk to us or put it in the chat, and Joe will manage that.
So folks, you can either type exclamation point in the chat or type in the chat what you would like your super system to be. I'm trying to think myself, Curt. I was thinking of microfinance as one of those options as well. Roy.
Okay, thank you, Curt. So I have in my imagination, I have a possible community that has come to me, and I won't say the backstory of that, but I live in a watershed here, the Licking River Valley, which feeds an awful lot of this region of Kentucky, flows all the way to the Ohio River. And I'm imagining that could be, in one way, a super system, thinking of that entire watershed. And yet I'm thinking of a community that is lots of smaller communities. And I'm picking out a particular community where extended area of where I live, and saying this would be like a community center. And we would all have a sense of the ethos of the entire watershed, such that we are ecologically sensitive and want to nurture the region ecologically. So that's a sample of a larger vision that I have as a possibility for this particular region.
That's excellent. Thank you. I see Jeannie has her hand up.
Okay, I'm thinking of a society where the drudgery is shared by all. And let me give an example of like baby diapers. So in the past, our super system was that, women did all the changing of the diapers, and the system was, that you had cloth diapers and they were washed out and, hung to dry, and it was a lot of work. And then, there were people like Fuller who felt sorry for women having to do all the drudgery. And they invented the plastic diaper, that we have now, where all the woman has to do, or the man can actually join in sometimes, is, take the thing and fold it up and put it in the trash. Now that thing ends up being, a hazard to our health. Plus, it's not a good use of materials. Plus, plus. It's a huge expense to raise a child and use all those diapers. So I'm thinking that, how do we move to that super system whereby, this would be a shared thing, and we do it ecologically where, the poo of the kid is being, used for some, actually Stroopy brought that up, it's the most valuable thing we produce. And, somehow that would be being used, in a productive way, and that somehow but the super system would, I think, have to change, whereby, it wouldn't be something that would just be relegated to certain people, here, do this for free. And, how many diapers one child goes through, the woman does, has to do all that work. Well, by making the plastic diapers, it hasn't really, it's shifted the responsibility onto the whole society, that we have, all of that in, all that plastic being used and all that. I mean, but then there is a kind of a subsystem that perhaps, somebody like Fuller would like to invent some kind of, diaper whereby, the kid poos and immediately it's sucked up and deposited in a little capsule, that can then be, put into an organic farm, or, something like that. I mean, there might be a technological fix that would remove all the drudgery, from that particular, activity, but, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know the future.
That's great. Thank you. Is there anybody else brave enough to tell us about a challenge? This is going to help us, folks, to have different ideas to explore here. So don't be shy. I'll give you another few seconds.
Can you hear me, folks?
Yes, Paul, go right ahead.
Okay, sorry, I'm in transit, so I'll try to be brief, and if it doesn't work, I apologize. But my thought is about a sort of a conceptual, and I may be off the mark, Curt, but if I am, just ignore it. But the conceptual universe of things that have risk associated with them, and the problem with our world is that the only things that get reported on are when the risk is manifested and somebody dies or a plane crashes or something like that. So this would be a way of increasing that universe to a world where there was risk, but the bad thing didn't happen, is reported on. 10,000 people with diagnosis of suicidal ideation did not kill themselves today. That's the best I can do. Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay.
I would go ahead. I would just suggest something along the lines of smart cities. Would be one of those systems where you develop effective ways of transit, and design the city actually for a minimum amount of usage of automobiles, making it walkable. There are cities that have actually engaged in this, where it's more human-centric design for a city. I actually have inquired about a course to take it, so I'd have to come back a little bit later to. But there are a number of other things, even just as far as how energy is used within the city itself, would actually be another way of in the system, the city would be a subset of the super system of the smart city, I guess. I don't know if that's a proper way of articulating that idea, but anyway.
That's great. Thank you. All right. That was great. Thank you, everybody. So as I was navigating it, click to the next screen, but that's okay. So this is one of a couple slides. There were explorations I did for a thing called the Design Science Studio. And actually that's starting up again. It's a project that's facilitated by the Buckminster Fuller Institute. And it's a lot of people with an artistic bent, a lot of people that do 3D stuff, but also people who do geometric explorations. And I was in it at one time as well. And when I was in it, I thought, well, Bucky defined pretty well for us, sort of this boundary of the system of interest. But it turns out that almost always within the boundary are multiple interacting systems that are part of the situation, right? They're part of the challenge. Like for Jeannie's diaper thing, there are the users that are really part of it. Maybe suppliers are outside of it, but certainly the users are inside of it. And so I try to come up with ways to show that the systems inside of it, of course, have some shape, some 3D shape, right? They have to be polyhedral, as Bucky told us, and they're interacting. And so then the idea of these slides is just to show from a couple different perspectives that, we can start to think of our challenge as these interacting physical, systems in 3 space, if you will, that are at least tetrahedral, and that would potentially help us visualize the interactions more clearly. So that's what this slide and the next slide are about. And then I came up with some ideas of how you might go through and do this sort of tuning in using this kind of a perspective, right? Which is, maybe having a couple models, physical models that you're manipulating, as opposed to just the circular view that Bucky had. So that's what these are about. And then yet one more 3D view where you can see that the system is sort of floating in 3 space. And at this point, they're not interconnected or associating, but of course they are. And the other thing is that for many design situations, the boundary itself is a part of these interacting subsystems, right? So if you think about Jeannie's diaper example, if these smaller systems inside the boundary are people wanting diapers, they have to have an interchange through the boundary to larger systems like diaper suppliers or to places that take soiled diapers, right? And so then they become part of that boundary themselves. So I haven't gone into this complexity, but I think you can intuitively know that that's what's happening. So then we can say for Jeannie, but she can jump in and clarify for us, that in the interacting systems, as I was saying, are probably the users. Larger systems may be the suppliers and the ecosystem. And but what about you other folks that are brave? Do you want to just take a few seconds and talk about what the interacting systems would be in your situation?
Feel free to unmute anyone if anybody wishes to share.
Well, I'll jump in, but I don't, it's all going to be just fresh here. I tried to get this idea that I spoke of as a community that was bounded by a specific region, ecological region, and that I even wrote to the president of Morehead State University saying this is something a worthwhile project. He could not envision quite honestly. In other words, he envisions in terms of direct application in the town of Morehead. So he couldn't imagine, himself as a part of a larger region, or he didn't want to anyway. And so I didn't get much response from that. And I'm just wondering how in the world can we help people who are habituated by their regular daily practices, managing or president of a university and all the courses. How can they go beyond that thinking that has a lot of a mechanical and routine to it to think in a larger system? That to me is quite a challenge. For it gets people to move out of the system that they're operating in and see a larger context that knows that actually is it is already present in their context, but they're not seeing it.
Well, I like that a lot. And I'm also struck, that in your situation, you've got a complex set of interacting systems within it, right? Obviously, the watershed is kind of outside it. Maybe some of the authority, the organizations that manage the watershed are outside of it. Clearly, the individuals with property are inside it. But there's a lot of interactions, perhaps. Well, let me just think about this for a second. We have a similar thing here in our area, that there's a lake which has a number of algae blooms, and it's reasonably clear it's what they call non-point source pollution, probably excess fertilizer from farm fields, and they haven't been able to manage it. And they've been depending on state agencies to figure it out. But of course, state agencies are imperfect, right? They're subject to a lot of forces, including political, of course. But they formed now a watershed association, where they have the individual landowners and the people who have land adjacent to the lake. They're getting together to talk about it. So you can see how this is starting to change and how we get this vision of the future coming in, right? Because in a situation I described today, we have all these individual landowners, but they're not really working together, right? They're just isolated, and they're relating, if at all, to these larger systems, which aren't necessarily responsive. And so then as they go forward, if they're organizing or self-organizing, essentially, they're forming this new kind of a structure, probably even beyond this microcredit thing, right? Because the microcredit related to an intermediate structure. Maybe it is similar. But anyway, this is a great example of talking about it. All right. Anybody else? Brave? Joe, you have any thoughts? Or Katie is something in chat.
I've been trying to just actually Katie has an exclamation point, but go ahead after that.
Yeah, I was thinking of Rose mentioning university. So I thought about when I was in school, my teacher wanting feedback, but the thing is that you might be separated by time. So you're there and then you're going to use it later. So I really liked your write-up for the meetup description, because I think that's what happens, either separated by time or like the systems are different physical locations. And that can be really why it's a hard problem to solve, even though people's intentions are good.
That's great. Thank you.
This is just thinking kind of out loud. And I just actually, if I were to think of the entire DoD and look at something like the Navy as a subsystem within a bigger system, and what would it be transformed? Well, one of the initiatives actually of the previous secretary, who had just stepped down, was actually global warming. So it was something that they, were trying to address in various ways, because they obviously knew what the repercussions were if populations were needing to, migrate, or in some of the I should say, discontinuity that would exist around the world if it gets worse. So I would guess that in some way, shape, or form, if you could actually redesign and use some of the military's might to actually address problems like global warming, and that would be something where you could take a subsystem and actually start to use various tools within that to address global warming. I would say that's only so far as that they do a lot of R&D, so that could be redirected towards solar power, different forms of energy, and different forms of clean energy, and things along those lines. And so And yeah, so I think a lot of that funding would actually go towards more living rate, as you would say, and less towards killing rate. And again, that's that's one small component of an entire complex, really.
Yeah, so thank you. And I realized after I, kind of riffed on Roy's comment that I hadn't really addressed it. And it's related to yours, right? Which is at a certain point, how do we get the people that are involved in the system, but yet not really aware, right, of the interconnections, complexity, opportunities, challenge, or whatever? How do we help them visualize it? And one would hope that these sort of approaches, these visual approaches, right, might help us go beyond, another report with just words and graphs. Hard to see it. So as we populate it. And then Joe, to yours, yeah, that's interesting because I've often had this vision of there's another road construction project. I don't really think we need improved roads right now. If we did the priorities, right, like on climate or whatever else, it'd be like, you know what, if we just took those people and resources and the energy, maybe they should be working on permaculture projects to manage water. Maybe they should be doing things to screen buildings against extreme heat, right? And so these are all cases where it seems like we look at the situation, we realize we can't perhaps solve it within the interacting systems, right? Because the homeowners, in Roy's case, or, the city dwellers in your case, can't maybe completely reorganize themselves to accomplish it. So how do we maybe enlarge that system to include enough of those people who, are helping to manage or shepherd the larger systems to help us solve it? So these are great examples. Jeannie's raised her hand now.
Yes.
Well, hearing Joe's reuse of the military, and it sort of stood out to me right away is, the government system. And if you happen to have everything in the same state, it's helpful. It's a little hard to work with if your district, covers 2 states. But here in Pennsylvania, the county stepped in and created a sustainability plan that just is quite incredible. It's very ambitious, but none of the cities would have done that, and the state itself wouldn't have done that, but it was done at the mid-level. And I mean, it remains to see if it's successful, but I'm thinking of these super systems as a lot of times being part of culture. And I'm a big believer in, sitcom culture that can touch people, sometimes in humorous ways to get them to sort of realize what's going on, or, to introduce new ideas. But I'm not sure this really works either, but it's at least something that sort of is out there and to some degree works sometimes.
Thanks. Yeah, just one more and then we'll move on, or one more comment on this. So thanks, Jeannie. That reminded me that I've seen, so I occasionally am part of a NASA webinar series on futures. And it's really interesting. This group, Convergent Aeronautics, has a mandate to address societal issues, maybe even UN Sustainable Development Goals, and create some sort of a model, and then figure out how, for example, Convergent Aeronautics, which could be drones, could be used to help essentially aid living rate. So it's kind of a different view than we may have had in the past from NASA. And so they've had a whole number of futurists, and I may even mention a couple other ones later. But one in particular said what we're seeing is that in certain cases, the highest level of government is kind of paralyzed. And yet maybe corporations know that something needs to be done, so they may take action. In other cases, cities need to, say, well, we need to do something in the city. And so what we're seeing is this sort of mid-level response that's not coordinated, but yet because it's a whole variety of approaches and different techniques, different areas, we're going to see a lot of development sort of based on it, that they saw that as the primary way that we're going to be addressing things like global warming, climate change in the near term is through those intermediate level things. So, all right, thanks everybody. So just to reemphasize that go ahead.
Roy, I'm sorry, Roy would like to speak again.
Oh yeah, go for it.
What I'd like to add, I just had this idea as you were speaking, Curt. One possibility to explore that realm with others that are not used to thinking in that realm is to ask certain kind of questions, like, and I'm going to bring McLuhan in here, if we were to use the tetrad, so that we would say, okay, so you're going to take an action, what does it retrieve, from the past that we already know? Then what does it enhance, and what might it obsolesce, make things go away so that we can enhance something better? And then, but if it goes too rough, too energetic and dominating, then it reverses the effects, but what I'm getting at is a questionnaire like the tetrad might actually help people awaken to the options.
Well, thank you. And so some of you know that I coordinate a thing called the Trim Tab Book Club, where we study either a book by Bucky or a book about Bucky. And I think he's still on the call. Jim Schroeds showed up. And Jim is a member and also fairly deeply into McLuhan. And so I'm wondering if Jim has some comments that he wants to share in the chat or by popping in. We've learned, of course, that, Bucky and Marshall McLuhan had some close association. They what was it, the Doxiadis, I'm going to mangle it, cruises and etc., where they got together and did stuff. And of course, then the books they did together, very interesting stuff. So I made a note on the tetrad. And like I said, if Jim's brave, he could pop in and say something, or maybe he'll come up with something later on it. But that's a very, very interesting suggestion, Roy. Okay, so I click to the next one. And so where we're at here is to say that I think so far when we've talked about the systems that exist, in terms of the boundary around our situation and the interacting system inside of it, we're kind of mostly thinking of physical stuff, right? Even though we know that any conscious or sentient system obviously is really, its behavior is driven by generalized patterns that are basically metaphysical, right? That result in behavior changes and certain actions and activities. So anyway, this is just to emphasize, Bucky's clarification that every thought is also a system, right? It has to have at least this fourness. And, his example is the Plato triad of beauty, truth, and symmetry. And you realize that it only makes sense if there's a fourth one, which is the observer. And I won't go too far into it, but just to emphasize that this is really important, right? In terms of what we do today and the way we interact is largely due to our beliefs in certain shared laws and routines. I mean, I think Jeannie mentioned anthropology, and I was going to put a slide in here about anthropology in the future to say that, if we want a different future, we really have to have kind of a different anthropology. And by that, we mean just the way that people relate, the things that they value, the things, how they do exchanges and etc. So that's why this one is in here. So then this is me from an early paper, talking about how we might see a diagram, that's flat and in circle, and think that there's only one way to navigate around it. And this is Peter Senge's tetrahedron of learning, but it wasn't a tetrahedron. He had it as a circle, sort of like the OODA circle, the observe, orient, or orient, observe, decide, and act, that you have to go through the particular sequence. But of course, we know that people don't really do that, right? They pop from one to the next. And that the way they, pop between them is by forces or fields, which might be known as verbs, right? Verbs. And that at the corners or the nodes, we have these relations coupling together, but no system is closed. All systems are open and exchanging things with the universe. This is actually right in synergetics as well. And so Bucky called them sort of leaky corners or leaky nodes. And then this is me in the Wayback Machine saying, well, what if you tried to actually map something like, how a fire is produced, a flame is produced in a furnace. And I'll just tell you, it's very difficult. This is a failed experiment, but I've left the paper up for decades now because I'm hopeful that somebody at some point will just say, well, Curt, one of the reasons that didn't work is you tried it at way too high of a level, right? And that maybe these corners or nodes are actually what Bucky called microsystems, right? So systems within systems. And then if you did that, you'd have more of an understanding of it. So this little section is just to emphasize that all the systems we see are held together by relations. And those relations are forces or fields, those invisible things, the metaphysical things, the generalized principles that determine how things happen. And here's one of the basics of how this works. So Bucky said that one of the things that we might believe from physics is this maxim: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And he's like, well, no, there isn't, because if there was, basically you'd be destroying energy. All right. So if you had energy coming in and it was, basically equal and opposite, bang, right? It would be like the antiproton and the proton coming together. So that there's always an imbalance in the extra, which in physics or math, we call the resultant, right? Is what he called precession. And go ahead. Oh, I thought I heard somebody. So anyway, this is just very simple view of precession. And so then guess what? I want you to think about some action you might take and some reaction and what that resultant might be. And I like to talk about, well, let's just say that my neighbor and I differ in our politics. We have an argument. At the end of the day, he hasn't perhaps changed my opinions, nor have I changed his, right? But there has been some little extra energy. And part of it is just we maybe understand each other a little more. Maybe we're mad at each other. That would be a bad thing, right? But there's always this little thing that comes off the side. And Bucky emphasized this was often the most important thing, right? The side effects are the most important effects. So once again, I want to pause and see if people can just think of a case which either they've experienced or is of interest to them, right? Like, oh, I try to do this and I get pushback and, I want to explore this. So just your ideas on that would be interesting to me.
If anybody has any comments, go ahead and type exclamation point in the chat. Do you want to repeat the question for everybody, Kirk, again, just so everybody's clear?
Yeah, thank you. So Bucky pointed out that the physics maxim, if you will, if that's the right word, of every action has an equal and opposite reaction is incorrect, because every time we have an action and a reaction, there's a little bit left over, and this is precession. And so this is, as he described it, when the pollinator goes into the flower, it's just going for pollen or nectar, right? It doesn't intend to pick up pollen and take it elsewhere, but it happens, right? That's the little resultant. And in that case, when it picks it up, the arrow is, I think, coming in. And then when it gets to the next flower, the arrow is going out, that resultant thing. And so there's many, many examples of this, this idea of actions, reactions, and the little extra stuff. So what are your thoughts? What's interesting to you, or what challenges have you found with this? And it says Jeannie is brave again. Thanks, Jeannie.
Okay, so I'm going to use it as an example. Me riding my bicycle. And so I'm riding my bicycle. That's very good for me and all. And is it helping change society? Well, so people come by and they're like screaming out the window, get off the road, or they're honking their horns and like, you know, they're just shocked that I'm out there on the road bicycling. It just disturbs them no end. Now, my problem is I'm a believer that precession is something predictable. And I'll tell you, in this example, there is no predicting whatsoever, but there is a resultant that I can measure, which is, you know, my own happiness of like biking by people and waving and saying hi and, you know, ringing my bell for the little kids. And, you know, so I'm actually making myself pretty happy as a resultant. But in terms of, you know, really being able to predict whether my action is making any difference at all in society is pathetic.
Thanks, Jeannie. Yeah, so that's another thing is precession, or, you know, is anything related to emergence, right? Because I mean, you talked about, you know, the effects of the unintended effects. And, you know, I mean, your intended effect might be, I want to get to the market, or your intended effect might be, I want to get some exercise. But of course, there's these things like you mentioned, oh, I feel better now, or I've seen something I wouldn't have seen before, or whatever else. So those could be the kind of side effects that go beyond the intended, you know, action reaction pair. And you brought the bigger system in as well, right? That if somebody sees you biking past, you know, then they've got their own set of perceptions, and that might be pleasing to see a biker. It might be upsetting to see a biker. And then beyond that observation, then there's this little extra, right? They feel like, well, I've got to see something, or they maybe have a memory that brings them back, or whatever. So it's a great example. And I think Paul put exclamation in chat. So how about that, Paul? What do you think?
Yeah, it might be building on your earlier example as well, Curt, but I'm thinking about, you give a political opinion to someone and they respond with the opposite opinion, but the amount of concern we should put into the resultant of the effect on the relationship is like vital, like, and it sort of relates to the super system. In this case, the super system of whether we have a civil war in this country is related to the resultant, like the emotion exchange, not the actual disagreement. So it's just relating a lot of what we talked about.
Yeah. You know, I have relatives that I didn't know their politics, and I just as soon not know their politics and have a good relationship. But unfortunately, we're on social media, and I see too much about their politics. It's like, no, I don't really want to know this. I just want to be, you know, you to be my cousin again, right? So there is I think, unintended side effect as well. So let's see, Joe, I think put an exclamation in.
Yeah, we have Joe, then myself, and then Julie. So I kind of missed on the first two. I must admit, I've been dealing with the situation, so I wasn't totally locked in. But let's just come back to the idea of the city itself, and maybe use that as an example. And something as a subsystem would be housing. And so how housing would actually be used efficiently. And Bucky has talked about this in the past, in Utopia and Oblivion and things like that, is not necessarily, well, I mean, Airbnb is actually part of an example of what he was talking about, but I would say the idea that you, and this is actually being discussed quite widely right now, how you would convert office buildings into housing and in order to satisfy the demand for housing, and actually hopefully bring down the price at some point. The immediate benefit to that is obviously you would have more housing, but there would also be substantial costs associated with that. And I haven't thought through all of them in the sense that the cost could be inflation in the area, actually. Because if you have more people in the area, then obviously there's more demand on goods. So even though you're increasing the supply of housing, you are actually increasing the demand for goods and services. So then things become more expensive within that. So I think that that's a little bit better an example than what my first two attempts were, which were just thinking out loud. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. I think we have more people behind, but just
We
to
do. We have
Bucky's idea of, why don't we pay people to stay home? Because it took the earth, and this was what, in the 1960s or 70s, essentially $1 million to make a gallon of gas. So wouldn't it make more sense for them to stay home? Well, what he said was the processional effect was that 100 of them may do nothing except relax, but the 100th one is going to do something brilliant that's going to pay for all the stuff. So that was his example of how something that seemed, in a way almost crazy has an unintended side effect that would be positive. So yeah, back to you. You said Julie's next?
Yes, correct.
Hi, I really know absolutely nothing about this topic, and it's really over my head, but I'm trying to grasp a little bit. And I think you're talking about how to affect big change, how historically has it happened in these different systems, how and then how in the future, how we can use our understanding to come up with ways to change the future that work better. So this procession thing, so if my action was, or somebody's action was trying to get the doctors in the hospital to understand that their bedside manner makes a difference by him labeling his observation and calling it doctor's bedside manner, even though none of those doctors might really get it that day. By labeling something, it can take a life of its own. Because originally there was no such thing as a doctor's bedside manner until eventually somebody saw something happening enough times, and then they labeled it, and now they have a college course in it. So that was a growth from a label.
That's great.
What do you think?
Excellent example of an unintended side effect, right? The doctor may think I'm simply providing information, but if they're, too clinical, too technical, too cold, if you will, right, then their intended reaction is simply that, oh, the patient says, oh, I understand it. We pick up on all these other subtle clues, right? And that's more important in many cases. I agree with you completely, Julie, than sort of the facts that are presented, right? So that's an excellent example. And let's see, Jeannie had raised her hand, and maybe there's somebody else too.
Yeah, Jeannie?
Well, I wanted to go on Joe's example of the, converting office buildings to housing. And the difference in the super system would be quite extreme in terms of you'd need stores, you'd need schools, and the effect on the transportation system, because when you have office buildings, although there's less people living there, you have more people traveling to that destination. So somehow the I'm thinking here in Philadelphia, but the transportation system is not going to be used in the same way anymore if all that if those buildings are turned into housing. So just wanted to bring that the resultant in that case would actually affect the super system.
Another great example, and excuse me, so I think it was also one of these NASA lectures where somebody talked about going out to the second level impacts of something, and they talked about driverless cars. What do driverless taxis mean? Well, maybe car companies dramatically changed. They're not selling as many individual cars And so therefore, there's a whole change in that thing. There's a lot less accidents, so there's a lot less money. This is all really good so far, right? But guess what? Since there's less accidents, there's less tragic accidents. So all of a sudden there's a big drop in organs for organ donation. And so everything that we do like this, right, has these first and second and third order effects that we may never, see until we actually build it. So this is very good. And we've had some stuff in chat, Katie and Kim, but I don't know if they want to say anything, or otherwise we'll just proceed on.
Katie,
Yeah,
do you-
sure. I could respond to what Julie was saying about the bedside manner. I was saying that you're saying that that's important. I agree with you. I was just saying that if a doctor makes the same mistake, if they didn't have bedside manner, they're more likely to get sued for it. So they might not see. I agree. They might not be able to connect their behavior to the patient's. Or in a lot of other systems too, like there's feedback systems. Now that I'm kind of thinking out loud, there's lots of like I don't know what they're all like vital grades. I don't know what they all are, but the way you could look up the doctor online, where some people write feedback. It's kind of like a Yelp for doctors, where it can affect like the reputation. So.
Well, this is great, you guys. Thank you very much. So, I think you see, some of the complexity, and you've already talked and realized that, oh yeah, I can see, this interface, between what we see as the challenge and the larger system. It's important, and it may actually need to change. There's some permeability about it. And, to go back to the, beginning premise, what we see today, as the situation we're trying to fix has these things in it, right? If we thought about a situation where, oh, we have just a whole bunch of doctors with terrible bedside manner, right? So then we see this kind of a thing happening within the system of interest, right? We've got the doctors, we've got the patient, we've got the interchanges and the bad bedside manner, and then the effects. And then if we think towards the future, we want to have a future where it's a good bedside manner, right? Well, maybe we can change all those individual doctors, or maybe we can't, but maybe there's a super system thing that might help it, right? Or, right, encourage it or discourage it, right? And so this is really the core message for tonight, is just that these interactions, and this interface between these, interacting systems and larger systems are very important today in the challenge, and perhaps even more important for tomorrow. And we've got something else in the chat. Let's just see. One more comment. Julie. Okay, go ahead, Julie.
Well, okay, if it's improvement, that's one thing, but a lot of these changes that we might want to see, aren't the problems come because we don't really have the right variables that are the ones that count. And then when we get it correct, then of course, everything would be better. But it's erroneously seeing the relationship between cause and effect in the wrong degrees.
Yeah, I would agree that in many situations, somebody thinks, oh, this is what it is. And they may say the obvious. They may say the action reaction as what they quote unquote have to fix, without understanding it's the procession, right? The resultant that's actually the thing that, is really driving the situation. So I completely agree. And
so when Dr. Phil, when he, historically, quotably says to someone who's in the therapy seat with the pattern going on in their life, and Dr. Phil says, how's that working for you? To get them to back up and say, hey, wait, there's a common denominator, me here, to back it up further than blaming. Isn't that
right? And in a way, you could see this as, I am the stable person, I respond in certain ways because this is what I learned, but that's really driven from sort of subsystem metaphysical patterns, if you will, right? And so when Dr. Phil says it, then he challenges you to go back and think about those and reorganize. I mean, this is my interpretation, Julie. I may have it mangled a little, but it's this sort of thing. So yeah, exactly, that there's a number of ways to come up with this new thing. And one way would be, to think about the subsystems and how they're interrelated. And I think your example is a great one for that. All right, let me go a little further. So this is a classic physics view of precession. Once again, an illustration from synergetics, that when the person jumps from one boat to the next, as you see, right, they got the action, the reaction, and then the resultant, right, which is the boats do something kind of unexpected, right? But you can see it very clearly because the boats are sitting on water, so they move very easily. We don't see it quite as easily in other media. But this is another example. It's another way to sort of, for us to visualize always, that systems are put together of relations, the relations come together, but it's not, it's not simply the interaction of those forces coming together. It's that excess or resultant that may be the most important. And then this is just to show that if we think about pollen and we look at these micro photographs of pollen, isn't this a whole nother level of precession, right? So that the pollen grains have evolved to where they're easy to stick onto a pollinator, or if the pollen is being carried through the air, that it's easy for an air current to pick up a pollen grain, or if the pollen needs to settle on the ground, that the pollen nature of the pollen exterior is such that it can, hit the ground and make contact in such a way that it's more likely to germinate. And so then we've talked about, this precession at this level of the insect, right? But just think about this, the surface, at the surface level. It's just really interesting, I think. Oh, and then if you like these kind of things, the Made to Stick book by the Heath brothers is a good reference. And then this was a note or mind map where I just said, my goodness, what are the kinds of precession and how does it relate to other things we might know from nature? Well, it's a form of systems coupling, which is a pretty big deal. And it could be related to various forms of symbiosis, right? Like commensalism or mutualism. And so then this gives us a very, very rich set of stuff, right? And so if we look at nature, we find all these wonderful examples that we can mimic. This is biomimicry, right? And I think we're finding that there's more potential in the human or social biomimicry than there almost is in the physical stuff we find, like the, the cool vehicles and materials and stuff. Okay, and I think we already talked about this. So just a little bit more. So another example of precession is when one body is orbiting another body. And this is easy to see if we think of the moon orbiting the Earth, right? So there's a force of gravitation that's pulling the moon into the Earth, but it doesn't crash into the Earth, does it? It doesn't crash in because it's got velocity. And if it was the velocity by itself, it would fly off into space. But it turns out that the interaction of forces of this compressional force, I'm going to call it, which is gravitation, and the tensional force of flying away, result in orbit. And that's why we have stable orbits. And this is an example of it, an illustration from synergetics. And then there's one here a little more complicated. And this just shows, if you kind of were able to zoom in and look at it, but you can also look at figure 1130.24 in Synergetics Online. What you see is the larger dashed line at the bottom is the orbit of the sun, seen as a linear thing. And then the circles that you see above it, the whole bunch of circles, are the Earth. And then the slower frequency one is how the moon comes into it. So it's complicated, but it's this wonderful situation that somehow has developed that these are more or less stable, at least for tens of thousands or hundred thousands of years. And guess what? There's metaphysical orbits as well. Like, for example, right now, we're orbiting Bucky Fuller and his ideas, right? So this is yet another question for us, is what are we orbiting? And this is a little bit hard to see. I made a number of cards a couple of years ago as an experiment to illustrate Bucky's ideas. And so what you're seeing on the right is there's lines of force of whatever they are, right? You could think of this as waves in the ocean if you wanted. And then you've got a couple of systems that are moving along with it, right? Because, they're subject to forces. And what you see is that there's this coupling between them. The lower left to the upper right is this compressional coupling. And yet it's balanced by this tensional force that I didn't show here. And the result is that one is orbiting the other. So right now we're orbiting Bucky. You might be orbiting a course of study or school, something about the community or an organization. And this becomes really important in terms of what is happening today, right? And the behaviors that we exhibit and what we're able to do, as well as what's happening tomorrow. Another example would be I orbited a school of engineering for many years, right? And I stayed in orbit and I learned as much as I could. And finally, I got to the point where I was like, well, I have enough. And then somehow I got escape velocity, right? And I went away from that school, but then I was captured, if you will, by a company that could make use of my abilities. And so I started to orbit that company, etc. So this is one of the basic motions that Bucky talked about that all systems do, orbiting, spinning, and etc. But I think one of the more interesting ones. And so once again, I want to pause and see if you have ideas of what you're orbiting and what that might mean.
So folks, go ahead, type exclamation point in the chat. I don't see anyone. I just want to make sure. Maybe, do you have another? Oh, Jeannie.
Okay, I'll give a kind of personal example. And I'm orbiting CJ, and I'm kind of hoping that it'll be like a slinky sort of, so that, the slingshot, I sling him and then he slings me. And then, so that actually we progress kind of together in some direction that I'm hoping will be a good one.
Thank you for that, Jeannie.
I love that. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Can you just talk a little bit about in and out?
Okay, but I also see a comment about orbiting. So from Julie.
Okay, please, let's go to the comments first.
So,
I'm sorry.
So, I think you understand, how the moon orbits the Earth, right? And it stays in a fairly stable configuration. And also that the Earth orbits the sun, which gives us the seasons, if you will. So that seems pretty clear. And what Bucky emphasized was every system and universe, all of us, are constantly in relation to a myriad of other systems. And we're in relation by these forces, these invisible forces and fields and relations, as he called them. And there's a certain subset, if you will, or a certain small set of ways that those present themselves, if you will. So one you might have heard of is tensegrity. And so, my arm is a tensegrity. If it was just bones, it would all fall apart. If it was just muscles, it would be all the way over here. But it's muscles and tendons, right? So it's got a compressive force and a tensional force, and they're so close to a balance that I can move my arm and do all kinds of things. So this is an example of coupled forces, and actually very related to the orbiting examples we gave before. When I talked about orbiting as something like a field of study, like Bucky, what I mean is I'm very attracted to it, right? I want to gain as much as I can from it. And yet I'm not totally obsessive. I haven't totally fallen into Bucky to the extent that I've moved to LA to try and convince the Institute to employ me, or I'm at, Stanford so that I could be in the archives every day, right? I do have some balance to my life. I do other things. And the result is that I stay in a good association with Bucky, and I feel I could escape, but I don't want to yet, right? I'm still gaining enough from this association with this interchange, right? And the interchange to me means that I can learn from it, but I can also express it in some way. And those ways would be writing an article or making a presentation or whatever. So the orbiting, is
So
often
thes-
we think of ourselves as
thesaurus,
orbiting.
like a word in the thesaurus that
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
I think I heard, is there another word for orbiting in the thesaurus? Is that what the comment was?
yeah, like a verb, another verb.
It's a great question. I like it a lot. To orbit is to stay in more or less constant relation.
So like maybe priority or orientation.
Okay. Yeah, it definitely has an orientation. Let's see, we've got a couple chats and we got Jeannie circling, Katie
Good.
says. And we've got Roy with an exclamation and Jeannie with a hand. I don't know who was first, but maybe one of you can help with this.
We had Roy first, then Jeannie. But if you want to reply to Julie, why don't you go ahead and unmute first, and we'll go to Roy.
So my turn.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm changing from, in my thinking right now, from systems science to psychological science or contemplative thinking, contemplative life. In the contemplative life, and I'm a longtime student of the contemplative life. I'll jump right to what I'm thinking here, is that what is circling or orbiting by a devoted contemplative is the silence or the stillness within. And they're orbiting the stillness to be centered in the Tao, God, however you want to reference that larger emptiness that is literally, infinite. And so there's a quieting that happens within each contemplative so that they can be receptive to what the universe has to provide. So that's a inner version of circling or orbiting.
Love it. Thank you. Jeannie.
Well, I can't really think of another word for orbiting, but the principle here is that you have two different forces, and circling doesn't quite capture that. So in my case of orbiting CJ, for instance, so I have my own destination, and it involves art, and it's quite different. And for CJ, he wants his chronophile, to be finalized and available to people. So I mean, he's got his direction and everything. So the thing is, there's forces that keep me interested in accomplishing his part of it, and there's forces that keep me headed in my own direction. So I think the thing that orbiting really captures is that you have two different forces that are working at the same time.
Yes, I love it. And it's not like, you're sitting in CJ's room all day just looking at his stuff and never doing anything else, right? This would be like falling in, right? You'd be just falling in and you'd never escape, but you have your own, right? And the balance is, right, that you stay. So thank you. So let's see, I think we got a couple more, right? We got Bob and DLJ.
That is correct. Go ahead, Bob.
Hi. I was trying to think of a synonym or a correspondence for orbiting. And what about every single concept, idea, place that you can talk about has an environment. So, surrounding it. So, so orbiting could, you could think of it generally as whatever relationship you can come up with that environment and that particular entity. So, and there could be an awful lot of them. And I've just been tuning in and out of this chat, and I was thinking of the flock of birds as an emergent situation, and wondering what causes that emergence to come about. What kind of or how would you look at it from the outside? And I just had some thoughts. If you analyze a flock of birds, if I recall, there may be 3 different things that how they relate internally, but externally, these birds are all driven by hunger. For example, hunger exists on the outside. Excuse me, on the outside for every living creature, and that's just a thought.
So go ahead.
I don't know what you think of that.
I think that's great. You have sort of 2 big thoughts there. And one is looking ahead a little bit. So, of course, we never just orbit one thing. If we were looking at this picture and I'm orbiting work and that's all I was doing is just paying attention to work, I'd be neglecting family, right? I'd be neglecting personal life. So I'm also as I'm moving through space, I'm orbiting that, but guess what? I'm also orbiting my partner, right? And I can go either way. If I just become a workaholic, guess what? I'm going to lose that orbit. My partner is going to spin off somewhere else. I'm not paying attention. I'm not in the relationship I need to be with that. So it's all this balancing thing. And I think this is a huge, huge deal with the future and also with the present, that we may not even be aware that this is happening. We may be paying too much attention, right, to something. And so then we're not paying enough attention to what we need for our own selves, or et cetera. The other thing is, emergent behavior. And if you haven't played with NetLogo, I really recommend it. And so it's a way to model emergent behavior graphically. It's super easy. You can download this Java app if you want, but you'll also pretty much run on your browser. And you can look at flocking of birds, you can look at building hives or many other things. And the interesting thing is it's got multiple tabs. So one is, the simulation as you're seeing it with some knobs, so you can change parameters. The other one is the code. So you can directly see the code's pretty readable. It's based on logo, and you can actually change and edit it on the fly. And the third one is an explanation. Like, this came from scientific paper, and this is what these things mean. And here's why we did it this way, that there's some basis to it. So I think that is a super powerful way to change the future. And once again, that's that subsystem change. Instead of trying to change what we have right now, we say we're going to give agency to individuals. That's kind of microcredit. That's kind of a bunch of other things that we see. Commons rules, where people get together to manage a commons by themselves. Instead of saying we're going to do it at this level or at the super system level, we say, guess what? If we actually work with the system interactions down here, it'll produce this higher level of behavior that's more desirable for us. So those are both really good. So thank you. And then I think in the sequence, we've got DLJ, is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah, that's correct. My sound working? You can hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Kurt's just taken the example I was going to use. I was thinking of competing social systems, and I was thinking of work and family. So if your child is sick and the daycare center phones up and says, your child's sick and you've got this presentation that you're just about to do to all the big bosses who've just flown in, what's your priority? I'm not quite visualizing the orbiting element of that, though, so because I'm not really good at visualizing things. The other one I was thinking of is the your sports group social systems. So, for example, there's a World Cup coming up, which fortunately is in the hemisphere I'm in at the moment. But if it was in the other hemisphere, then I might be staying up late, and then not both the child and the sport could result in you not turning up to work. you'd expect in one case the work side of things to be slightly more sympathetic, and the other side and the other not. But then I guess the question is, you're leading to how do you integrate that so that the systems can work together? And I'm not sure I've got an answer for that one. And help me visualize the orbitingness of those systems, if you could.
Right. So on your first one, so thank you, because you made it much more real for us. And I would say that the orbiting, how I would view it, so if I continue to orbit work, it means that I have this, tension compression is still roughly balanced, right? They're able to say, well, Curt, yeah, you need to take this week off, but I don't just sort of disappear, right? And just care for my kid and never even tell them, because then I would no longer be in orbit. They'd have to say, well, Curt, we know something's going on, but we don't have enough information, so we're not going to continue to have that, couple of relationship. So the orbit is just that you continue to have enough of that feedback, right? The tension compression loop, the exchange, to maintain, that continued relationship. So you can think of the orbit as a kind of a stable relationship. It's dynamic, but stable in that sense. So that's kind of how I would view it. So I don't know if that helps or not, but I thought that was great.
Thank you. Okay, so when you've got the two systems, which are in conflict, what's the orbiting that's, are you in two orbits?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Because you remember, this whole thing is like that chart I showed of the moon and the earth and the sun. Well, guess what? The sun is also orbiting certain stuff in the galaxy, right? So if you think about it, it's just really complex, right? Interplay, dynamic, more than a ballet continually. And could it change? Well, sure. One could think that a huge meteorite could strike the moon and all of a sudden, it would change and it would go away from us, right? And then, we might still be in orbit around the sun, or we might not. It's a big enough thing. But yes, it's what's happening is that you've got these things going simultaneously, and you have to decide on a moment by moment basis. Do I follow this path, which is show up for work tomorrow morning, or that path, which is I'm going to take the kid to the doctor? And so this is a really sort of a micro level view, right? We're zooming in from the big orbiting view, which might be even on an annual basis. It's almost a moment by moment basis as to how we choose that path, if you will. I know I'm arm wavy, but that's the kind of thing.
That's good. Thank you.
It might be Jeannie next with the hand raise. I'm not sure, Joe. So
I believe it is Jeannie, then myself, then Paul.
I want to take it back about the two forces, because actually there's more than two. And I like the drawing that Curt has up here, because you see those lines. The orbiting thing is going through the environment. And I like to think of, say those lines would be the society. So even though we may be in orbit, there's going to be a kind of a drag perhaps, or maybe a push in some places where the orbit will not exactly stay stable. And Curt kind of stole my thing. I was thinking, if a big comet comes by, there is force on the moon that's making a difference. It's just, is it big enough to throw it out of orbit? So but yes, there's more than two forces going on here, but the force is, my own velocity in a direction and my desire to, assist in a different direction. So there's two different things that I'm being pulled by that cause the orbit. But then you've got that third thing which is the whole society, and what is actually accomplished really depends on those lines I see. The little tetrahedrons are pretty well, I don't want to use the word pathetic again, but not maybe so powerful.
yeah, I tried to get AI to draw me pictures and I failed, Jeannie. So, but I haven't given up yet. So okay, let's see. So who's next, Joe? That was a great comment.
I was just maybe going to come up with maybe a possible example would be something along the lines of an employer making a determination of allowing somebody to work from home, or actually do they have to come in? And you have two forces there. You have the employee that wants to stay at home, but you know that they're slightly more productive when they come in the office. However, the talent level of the employee is worth more than someone else you could to replace that individual. So therefore, you have to balance the fact whether you're going to have that other individual, like you're going to let them work from home, be slightly less productive, but they would ultimately be more productive than, say, replacing that individual. So that would be two opposing forces that are kind of working against one another.
Nice.
I could also think one in the city as well, using the same analogy with buildings and with super systems, but I still haven't thought that one through yet. So, but anyway.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you.
So next up we have Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I'm beating on the same bush that DLJ was beating on, but trying to come to grips with this, because I don't like a switch from the physical world to the metaphysical that then kind of immediately breaks down and doesn't actually work. So I think we're struggling to make it work, because you don't orbit around one thing. But then we said, well, can you orbit around many things? We've been trying to justify that. So I'm more envisioning something that is really, it's going through, you can't really say it's an orbit of around one thing, because it's moving through space and then it's pulled by one thing, but its velocity is enough to escape that orbit. But now it's in another, because of a motivation towards another thing, it expressed on the accelerator, escape that orbit. Now it's in the orbit around the kids for a few minutes until it sees the motivation away to something else, and then it's in orbit around that. I mean, that's more like real life to me than anything that has been said so far. And it's so, I sort of feel like trying to relate it to how things actually behave in outer space is very difficult and makes it break down a bit. So that's my thought.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all. That was great. Very rich stuff. Well, we're running out of time and there's more material. I should probably show you at least a couple more slides. So this is the classic Bucky, talking about how systems interrelate. And so on the lower right, there are two systems with a single relation. And he likened that to molecules of a gas. They're free to move in any direction and associate. And then above it, in the upper right, he said, well, and if you have essentially two lines of relationship, now it's like a hinge, and it's now more like a liquid, right? There's lots of things you can do it. And in fact, I think in many ways, metals show a similar thing, right? That there's a lot of malleability. And then finally, if you're starting to share three, then you're actually talking about how these systems are conjoined or forming one system. And this has led to some interesting things. I mean, if I think about it from a sustainability perspective, this single line of contact might be an extractive operation, like taking fossil fuels, right? Or it could be parasitism, where I'm just taking and taking, never giving back. Whereas once we have two potential places of contact, we have the possibility of exchange. And so then in human relations, right, we know situations where we have somebody who wants to be a friend, but they're just taking, they just need, and they don't give back. It's just not stable, right? And so then this relates also to regenerative systems, the fact we need to give back to the larger system, and to think about the fact that there's always, more than one. This is too detailed. I'm going to skip over it. I just want to, I think, have just one more thing to emphasize, that people are polyhedra. I mean, obviously we're physical polyhedra, right? If you get onto a low level, we're not perfect surfaces, right? We have, nodes and relations, at the surface of our skin, and we're also metaphysically polyhedra. And so I've had students, this is John's work from former class, and I said, you know, how would you visualize yourself as a polyhedra such that you have nodes, of course, where you're taking in things you need, like food and energy and water, but also ones where you have excess, which is your abilities, your creativity that you're providing to other systems. And then, of course, you know, what do you get back? Is that a transactional thing where you get paid or you get satisfaction from showing it or whatever? And so just to be able to think of ourselves this way. So, and once again, 3D versions of it, and then how you'd work through it. And I think now we're I think we're kind of past the time I was going to spend on it. Yeah, it's 8:45 here, so hour and 45. So I think we should kind of skip out of it and just go back to a general conversation about the topic and the material. And I think you've got the general idea, which is that, you know, if we were to visualize this desirable future and say, I want to go towards this vision, that vision is going to be essentially manifested as interacting systems that are embedded in larger systems that depend on smaller systems, right, to provide sort of that, the lower level emergent, you know, the interactions that provide emergence. And so we can't just consider our vision of the future as this isolated thing that we're just going to design it and plop it down and then there you go, it's just going to work, right? And also that we can use that same level of thinking and analysis to look at today and come up with ideas of, oh, why is this thing stuck? In systems thinking, they say if you see a stable behavior, and once again, a stable behavior isn't like this necessarily, a stable state, it could be an oscillation, it could be increasing, could be decreasing, but regardless of what it is, what's happening is there's one set of forces in the larger system that are increasing it, and another set of systems or another set of forces in the larger system that are decreasing it. And it's that balance, once again, that gives you the resultant. That's the behaviors we see. So everything we see, whether we like it or whether we don't like it, comes from these forces, these interacting forces. And if we understand it from the get-go, we have a better understanding of where we're at. And then also, you know, same, in the future, we might have to modify the forces or how we interrelate with them to achieve the vision we want. So that's kind of the overall picture of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Curt. I mean, this was actually fabulous. I know I started out a little slow there with a couple of my examples, but no, it kind of came together. I thought very nicely, especially when you're talking about the circles of irrelevancy. I think that it's a good way to start, because what it does is it sets boundaries. So if I were to, you know, take the example that I was just using with the idea of conversion of a building and thinking about all the things that were going on with that, you know, there would be things that would be making it almost relevant, right? So one of the examples would be the idea of it becomes cost prohibitive to convert a lot of these buildings because there's plumbing issues that exist where there's only one bathroom on one floor and the way the lighting is done for the buildings and things like that. So to convert it to actual apartments would be a very big challenge, which would make the building almost relevant. So what would then bring it into relevant? Well, then that would have to be a set of incentives that work with the city in order to get tax abatements and things along those lines. And then you'd also have to think about how that would work within the subsystem you know, as we had talked about some of the things like you know, the infrastructure that would actually be needed in order to have housing versus, you know, versus a office building, and where you would have, let's just say, 2 more million residents as opposed to, you know, 2 more million employees, and what would be the difference to that? So I think that what it is you're setting up boundaries and you're seeing what is then the possibility within those boundaries, and then that's pretty much where you can kind of take things that are from irrelevant to relevance and bring them into make them possible. So I very much appreciated that. It took me a minute to get there, but anyway.
Thanks, Joe.
no, that was a great session, and I very much appreciated how you worked in precession and things along those lines. Folks, type exclamation point in the chat. I'm not the only one with the takeaway for sure. So that you can share your thoughts on Curt's presentation. First of all, I also want to thank you again, Curt, for taking the time each month to bring us a new topic and get us to really what I've appreciated most about these classes or these lectures, I should say, is that that you really get us to think about not only what Bucky and his philosophies, but also the future, and in a very practical way. So I think I very much appreciate your efforts with that. You're really, I think, pushing and stretching our minds a little bit. So we're very grateful. But go ahead, Jeannie.
It's hard to top what Joe just said, but I really appreciate, the idea of looking at the future. It's so difficult to think about what it's going to look like. And yet it's really important that we, begin to think about that and direct the society in that, in different ways, because, well, that's the obvious. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the most beneficial things I think to think about are the repercussions of our actions more than anything else. A lot of times we take actions that are maybe will stop the bleeding, but it won't necessarily solve the problem over the long term. So in the sense that I think of it in terms of, again, even if I were to the idea that I was playing around with, the idea of conversion, because there's a shortage of housing, thus convert buildings that are already in existence. There are a lot of issues that come along with that that need to be thought out and before you make that decision, because it could be over the long term more costly than, say, if you were to potentially didn't want to go here, but maybe tear down and rebuild something more energy efficient for the long term, and something that's much more ecological friendly, that would actually be much more in line with over the long term, be able to limit the costs of the building itself. So if you think about it, if it's energy efficient and your bills are much lower, and then you can bring the rents down, which is actually very important, considering that much of the reason these conversions are not happening is because the current day financing on these buildings are that there's too much of a loss to be had by the current owners, so they're hanging on to buildings with 20% occupancy. Anyway, there's a lot of things to be considered, and I think you walking us through that without going into detail, and I thought about it in terms of even the price point is, if you did most of the modifications, sometimes in most of these buildings, they're usually much higher rents than they would be for what the average individual could actually afford. So therefore, you'd be pricing yourself out of the market. So that's a repercussion. That's one of those things that you think about. I'll do the remodeling, but if your tenants can only pay $1,500 and you have to charge $2,000, and I'm not saying this is very transactional, I understand, but it is something that where you have to consider the costs anyway.
Yeah, I see Julie put exclamation, and Trini raised her hand again. So a couple more and then I have to sign off. But once again, thank you all. Thanks for nice comments, Roy and all. Julie?
Oh, thank you. this kind of is like a watershed experience for me, kind of like the workshop that we did on the future of leadership. I mean, I don't think about the future that much, and when I do, or when people do, it's often a goal, and then they just set out doing it, and then maybe later they see, oh, getting rid of this one little population of the animal species affected everything. But this almost opens up your consideration at all times about different things interacting with each other. So it's kind of like a globally inclusive type of perspective and thinking that I could see coming from this.
Thank you. Jeannie.
Well, I just wanted to say on Joe's, I know this is a really irrelevant comment, but on Joe's rebuilding and stuff versus changing, all of this reinforced cement is not built to last. So all of this is going to come down pretty soon. So we might as well start thinking about you know, how to build without reinforced cement.
Great. Yeah, so I can see a lot of stuff about unintended consequences. Well, thank you all. This is wonderful. And hope to see you all next month. And thanks, Joe and Shrikant and everybody else for all the support.
I mean, this has been, it's been a real treat for each month, and we very much, I very much look forward to this personally. And we've been grateful to all the Bucky presenters who have really been here. They've all done a fabulous job. So we have some upcoming events here at 52 Living Ideas. Tomorrow night we will have poetry. Maritza will be leading that, and the theme, I think the poet is Ezra Pound, and the theme will be interconnectedness. And so that is for tomorrow night. That then on Tuesday we'll be covering Confucius, and we'll be finishing or beginning chapter 12. I'm sorry. Or there may be two, actually, I don't have my book in front of me, but I think we may have two more verses in chapter 11. I think we may have 25 and 26 to do. I have to go back and look. And so, and for Wednesday this week, for Comprehensivist Wednesday, we'll be doing the deconstruction of language. So I don't know. Jacques Derrida, if I'm saying that correctly. And then that's on Wednesday with Phil. This Thursday, I am not sure actually what we have posted. Let me take a quick look. This Thursday. Sorry, folks. Aristotle's Poetics. And the Birth of Aesthetics. So that'll be nice. That's actually going to be fun. And that will be, those are the only things on our calendar up until this Thursday. So, all right, everyone. Thanks for great comments, great session, and I hope everybody to see you sooner rather than later.